MusicalTalk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello, and welcome to another edition of MusicalTalk. I'm Thos and am I alone in thinking that the public's appetite for the musical Hamilton is rapacious? I'll just let that one sink in for a few minutes, or perhaps sink under. Well, let's instead move on to the order of business for today. Now, yesterday saw the end of the 2021 Edinburgh Festival Fringe. But much more remarkable than the end was the very fact that it had a beginning at all, because it won't have escaped your attention that in 2020 we didn't have an Edinburgh Festival Fringe at all because of a global pandemic relating to COVID-19, and whilst things are considerably better here in 2021, they are not by any means perfect. And so, like many Sondheim characters, we're not out of the woods. But despite all the problems facing everybody, it is, I think, a minor miracle that the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2021 took place at all. Now, it was, by necessity, one of the smallest Edinburgh Festival Fringes in probable living memory. Certainly one of the smallest, I imagine, since the 1940s and 50s, which was when the Fringe first started. And according to the EdFringe's own website, they estimate that there were approximately 700 in-person, which is to say physical shows at this year's Fringe. Now, most of those are going to be one-person shows, quite a lot of those comics, because of course they're very easy to set up. Whereas, as you can imagine, drama and even more so musicals require a larger cast usually, and certainly a number of people to act as musicians. So it's already a bigger organisational problem to set up a musical, even at the best of times. And I don't think anyone would have said that 2021 was that. However, there were a few offerings in relation to musical theatre. On the website this year, if you had gone to the category marked Musicals and Opera, you would have found 24 separate shows. Now, it has to be said only a handful of those were physically in person. By far the majority were virtually available. But that did have the virtue, of allowing people from across the world who normally wouldn't have the opportunity to actually get to Edinburgh to see the shows in a physical environment to join in this year's Fringe. And indeed, other Fringes across the world were doing something very similar. The Brighton Fringe in June and July this year had many virtual shows, and the same is true of the Hollywood Fringe, where our old friend Michael Gordon-Shapiro was premiering Gideon and the Blundersnorp, live, but with a virtual stream. There were a few shows in Edinburgh this year doing that, in the musical world, but most were pre-recorded, either on stage and then the recording shown on a video streaming network or on the Edinburgh Festival Fringe's own Fringe player, or they were pre-constructed in mid-COVID lockdown periods, using separate cameras, quite often on telephones, and sort of patched together. I think that's a kind of musical we won't see again in the future, if we're lucky, because it's possibly the least of the three options, but deserves applause that anyone should even attempt a musical that way. And we'll be talking about all these different formats in a future episode of MusicalTalk, as we also discussed the offerings that were available to people this year. Now, obviously, this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe coverage is, by necessity, smaller than it's ever been before because of the smaller number of musicals that there were to see. So, over time, over the next few weeks and months, you'll be hearing our reviews and our thoughts on the shows that you could see, and we'll also be continuing our virtual Edinburgh Festival Fringe from last year, where we look at some of the shows which you can find free of charge all over the internet on Vimeo, YouTube and other streaming platforms. But today we're going to do something that we don't do very often in order to introduce this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe coverage here on MusicalTalk. And that is to talk about the Fringe as a concept and as a thing in its own right. So very much less looking at the individual shows. We'll be starting on that next week. But today I'm going to be talking to Colm Molloy, the noted composer, about his Edinburgh experiences and comparing them to mine, just to give you a sense of the flavours, the feelings, the sense of what it is to be at an Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And in this case, this recording was made last year when we were pining the most. And whilst this year's Fringe may not have felt anything like the things we're going to be describing, I can almost guarantee that next year's will. I hope you enjoy this conversation with the ever-lovely Colm Molloy. MusicalTalk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. It will be interesting to talk about some aspect of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe which no one ever really talks about on Musical Talk, which is the general sense of it. We all specifically talk about shows that we've seen, but we very rarely talk about the ambience, the feeling, the sense of what makes the festival what it is, which is it's the biggest arts festival in the world, and that's a sentence. I mean, you can look at that and say, yes, that's true, but there is something sort of almost tangible in Edinburgh, I think, during the festival season, and it's all pervasive, certainly in the centre, but also beyond the city. I've been to shows outside the city limits, well into the hinterland of Edinburgh. So briefly, I mean, I've been going my story is very simple. I go to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe and have done every summer since 2007. You've also been to the Fringe on a number of occasions, wearing different hats and in different capacities.
It's true, yes.
Before we sort of talk about how you experienced it, just quickly, if you can, just explain
what have
you done and when did you do it?
I first went to the Fringe in 2015, and I was a pianist in a play about Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner, which was great fun, and it was my first time going to the Fringe. I just started university as well, so it felt like a kind of baptism of fire, but a fire I was very willing to get
engage with.
Yeah, and that was for a whole month, and there were lots of anecdotes associated with that time. And then I've been twice as a regular punter, whether, slumming it on the floor of friends' bedrooms or staying in a kind of modest hotel or B&B. And I've also gone bringing my own show, which was 2 years ago. I wrote a musical and I hired some actors to be in it, and was up there for 2 weeks doing my own piece, which was stressful in a very different way, and I would do that again, but I think I would need some more support if I were to do it again.
Well, I think that's quite interesting. I'd actually like, if I may, to sort of go through your experiences in an episodic format, and I think the putting on your own show at Edinburgh has got to be, if you like, the end of it, because that's the big one.
Sure.
So the first time, how many years ago was it when you went
5 years ago. The first time, yes, 5 years ago.
So within the last 5 years, another Edinburgh stalwart and favourite. So that's when you first went. So it's your 4 trips in 5 years. So that makes you a regular, even though you're doing it in different ways. Now, that was with the university or just in the university holidays?
It was in the university holidays. I wasn't associated with the school at all. It was actors from Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. One of them had written a play and he got his friends to be in it, and I think I was outsourced through a friend of a friend to kind of be MD. I was playing a character which was the jukebox in this play. The bartender has a jukebox, which was me and this other lady who was a saxophonist, and money was put into us and we would come alive and play music, and then that would encourage kind of the ghosts of Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner to come on and sing On the Street Where You Live, One for the Road.
Various hits.
Those kind of things. Yeah.
They're standards.
Yeah.
Certainly his standards, anyway.
Yeah. It was great fun. Really, really enjoyed it. It was my first experience of flyering, and I'd been to Edinburgh before, but not during the Fringe with my family, and I think having been to the Fringe now so many times, it's very hard to even contemplate Edinburgh without the Fringe.
Although it's a grand place to visit outside of the Fringe period. I also love it at other times of the year, but it is something remarkable.
Yes.
During the Fringe period, isn't it?
But it's a great opportunity as well to experience the natural kind of surrounds of Edinburgh. I have a friend who lives in Dunoon in Scotland, and he came to visit me when I was in Edinburgh the first time, and he has a history in kind of geology and archaeology, and he took me away from the shows I was doing, and he said, we're going on a walk around Edinburgh, and he took me to Prince's Street, which looks over Edinburgh Castle, and he said, okay, I'm going to teach you about Edinburgh now. And he said 10 millennia ago there was some kind of volcanic eruption, and he told me how the Mile was formed and all these kind of things, and took me completely out of the fringe mentality and taught me about how Edinburgh came to be as a kind of landmass, which I still distinctly remember as a kind of formative part of my time at that first fringe. So, you know, Frank Sinatra in the evening and archaeology in the morning.
And geology.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you've touched on something very interesting there, which is Scotland and Edinburgh as a place in its own right. I mean, we should never forget that it's the capital of Scotland, but it's also, you know, it is a great city, and you can go at any time and see the big things and the small things. Just walking along the streets of Edinburgh will always afford you some entertainment or interest. And it's interesting you spoke about Princes Street. So, if you like, that's the border between... The railway line sort of bisects the city in a strange way up to Waverley Station. Mm-hmm. And you've got the medieval heart on one side, which is the castle and the Royal Mile and the older houses around there. And that's one focal point for the fringe. And then you've got what's called the New Town, because in Britain anything anything that's merely Georgian is considered new. So, you know, it's all 18th century. Yes. So the New Town, which is the Georgian stuff, is on the other side from Princes Street, which is the principal high street, downwards towards Leith, if you like. I mean, it doesn't go that far, because it's obviously a sprawling modern city goes off like rings of an onion, but it has a very distinct geography and architectural feel of its own right. And then obviously there's further rings that go out. And I think it's because it's such a striking city, and of course, you know, you cross bridges from one side to the other. You always think there's a river, and there isn't a river. It's a railway line
like
for the most part.
It's like a 3D city, isn't it? It's like a labyrinth. There are roads underneath you, and those roads then become roads that are above you. It's like being in an MC Escher print.
Well, I think it's like a very good poem. It works on lots of different levels. So, but of course, you're walking. But you're walking along, and you also see the sea in the distance and Leith, and you know that's amazing. And then there's Arthur's Seat, which a lot of people sort of climb. And then
whether sober or not.
That's fair. It's easier when it's sober, when you're sober, and it's also easier if it's dry. Neither of which is always the case. And then on the other side, you've got Carlton Hill, which has got sort of follies on it. You know, there's a
peculiar kind of Victorian Greek relics.
That's exactly. There's a kind of
Roman
Athenian forum frontage, but no more than that, and a sort of a lighthouse kind of sort of pillar. Yeah. It's a sort of Nelson Memorial, I think. I went in it and it was interesting. Not unlike the monument in that sense, you know. You climb to the top and see the view, and it's amazing.
Sure.
The observatory, the old observatory, is up there. So there's so much to see in Edinburgh, and I think that just adds to the sense of the fringe. But can you remember the day you arrived the very first time? You may not be able to, but do you have a sense of how you felt, or the experience? Did you get a sense of palpable excitement? Because I certainly did.
Oh, sure. I
felt I was straight into the melee of something bigger going on than I could possibly imagine.
Absolutely, and I think that's why I consider myself a city boy, despite the fact my family's all from rural Ireland. I think going from London up to Edinburgh and it feeling like you were still in London, and just noise
in terms of bustle and
sure, people from every direction, and despite the fact that the Edinburgh Festival Fringe is the biggest festival in the world, arts festival, there are so many other festivals going on at the same time. So not only are there people coming for this huge monolith, there are loads of other people for loads of literary festivals and international festivals. And
they used to have the television festival, and there was a cinema festival, and the tattoo is on at the same time as well. Yes, so you're right, and people are there for all manner of businesses. One of the other things I really like, it is that multi-layered thing. I mean, the city is multi-layered physically, but the festival arrangements are, you've got the international festival proper, and then you've got the fringe of the international festival, which is what we all think of, and that is the fringe, and that's the biggest thing, but it's encompassing, as you say, all those other festivals going on at the same time. You know, yes, there's genuinely something for everyone. And of course you slip from one festival to the other. I mean, it was a throwaway, but as part of the Edinburgh Fringe, I went to the world's biggest Bunting festival some years ago. Now, I'm not sure there were many other Bunting festivals, so the world's biggest Bunting festival didn't have to be very big to be the world's biggest Bunting festival. And it was up at Greenside, the original Greenside near Royal Terrace in the New Town, which was their first and foremost venue, and they've started spreading into the city more and more. But I used to like Greenside. I still do. But they had the International Bunting Festival there, and it was allegedly the biggest bunting festival in the world.
And how was it?
Well, it was very bunting-y. I mean, basically, it was round the back of the church area, and they had strung bunting in excess. And it was different kinds of bunting. So, it was handmade bunting and flags and colours and shapes.
Tartan.
I can't give you a blow-by-blow account of every bunting triangle on offer.
Fine.
But it was, if you like bunting... And I am a
Place
fan
to
of bunting. It was because. But the really important thing about it is, it's not so much that it was the bunting festival. It's where else in the world are you going to be able to visit the bunting festival, and it's not the biggest thing that's happening.
Well, yeah, and I guess that's it as well. I think even if there were just the Edinburgh Fringe on, and that was it.
Yeah.
I wonder if the atmosphere would feel slightly different. It's the fact that there are all of these things happening,
and you can slip in and out.
Yeah.
I mean, a friend of mine, Vicky, she always goes up to the Fringe with her family, but she does the Fringe stuff and they do the tattoo stuff. So the same family wants to do different things when they're up there. Mm-hmm. And you get other things as well. I quite often stay in the university accommodation down by the Pollock Hall near the Commonwealth swimming pool. And I remember a few years ago that there was this will seem unsurprising when you think about it, but there was an international bagpipe festival going on at the same time, and a lot of American tourists who have Scottish ancestors had come over, and they were practising in the morning in the grounds of the Pollock Halls.
Oh my gosh.
Not antisocially, by which I mean at 7 o'clock in the morning. It was 9 o'clock or more than that, but it was early-ish in Edinburgh terms, because I think it would be fair to say Edinburgh days tend from late to late. You start late in the morning and you stay up late till night.
Yes.
So, and there aren't really many shows. There's a few shows on at breakfast, but really, there's really a big gap of shows until about lunchtime. It comes alive about 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, I think, Edinburgh, in the morning, and runs through to 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock and beyond, I suspect. Or, as I should have said, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, rock. Popular music reference there.
Edinburgh rock.
Yeah, very nice. Nice soft rock. So, the Bagpipe Festival was on, and so it was hilarious and terrible and wonderful, just to sort of cross over to have breakfast, whilst a lot of, in this case, American gentlemen and ladies were playing the bagpipes to warm up for their bagpipe fest later in the day. It doesn't happen every year, or certainly I haven't seen it happen every year, but it was a big thing that year, I remember that. And it was a very odd circumstance where it appeared, certainly in the university accommodation, that most of the people playing the bagpipes were not themselves Scots. So, but visitors, But the city seems to rub along very nicely. I've never come across any particular trouble. Quite the reverse, it always seems, it must be quite an imposition if you live in Edinburgh, that for pretty much all of August it's going to be absolutely rammed and the roads will be closed and you won't be able to go to your favourite restaurant probably quite as easily and things like that.
Yes.
Do you remember a palpable sense of excitement?
Oh, completely.
Yeah, and how did you experience it?
Well, I think it was also the knowledge of having not done this before and learning from anecdotes of other people about things like very short get-in times, very quick get-out times, and the fact that, God, I've got 5 minutes to, get dressed and put this thing in place and then get sat, and then once the show's finished, I've got to leave in 3.5 minutes. So I went in with lots of apprehension, but it was excited apprehension once you see that there are 5 million other shows going on there as well, and you're all kind of competing for approval ratings and screen time
support.
Well, it does become a nice family atmosphere, even though there is this sense of competition as well. You make friends with almost everybody, and you go and see their shows, they go and see your shows, and it's this crazy month of incest, and the best kind of incest.
Social incest, I think, is an adjective desperately needing to be inserted into that.
Yes.
Well, it's a trade fair. That was Sarah Louise Young, the noted cabaret performer, and I was interviewing her once, said the Edinburgh Festival Fringe is a trade fair for everybody, for performers of all nature, actors, performers, comics, but also the tech people. I've got friends who I only ever see in Edinburgh. They are my Edinburgh friends, as I think of them.
Sure.
They don't live there. It's just that I see them every year at Edinburgh, and they come from all over the world. It's interesting, I think, that should be the case. But conversely, the flip side of that is you also see generations of performers, particularly from the universities. The universities send a lot of performers up to the Fringe.
Sure.
And you sometimes, I remember particularly Durham used to have, and I'm sure it still does, but certainly had a very, very strong performing arts musical society duologue. So it's the Durham University Light Opera Group. so it was always musicals. I mean, it wasn't always light opera, but it was always musicals. And they had a lovely diverse range, and almost every year was very, very successful. And I remember there were a little cohort of people I saw, I think over 4 years, and you saw them go through their university career, and then they disappeared and I never saw them again. And I've had that experience several times. People I've seen or interviewed or just got to become chums with on a temporary basis, really, come and then disappear. And I'm sure they go as punters, maybe not every year, but every now and then, because it's in the blood, as it were. But
that tends to be the main playing age is university age, I guess.
It really is, yeah. I mean, there's plenty of other shows.
It is for everyone. I get you don't. It's not doesn't discriminate against old people. You get all walks of life.
You do indeed. It's just that universities have a very high percentage of people present because they have more free time, I suppose. You know, but it's easier to say, right, I should book out August this year because I'm free.
School's out.
Yeah, exactly. Which would be harder for me as a professional in middle age. I can remember very clearly my very first day in Edinburgh at the Fringe. I was meeting a friend who was travelling separately, and we were both coming by train but on different train services. And I got there fractionally before him because he had a delay. And I got there because it wasn't a night service, it was a day service. And I think I got there about 5 o'clock for a show at 45 minutes later on, and then he was going to join me after that. That's the way we'd arranged it. And so I came out of Waverley Station, and I knew Edinburgh because I'd been several times before, but not during the Fringe. And I remember it just feeling madly different. And I just got out of Waverley Station, and I was in, I think it's called Market Street, which is the bottom of Geoffrey Street. So it was that side I'd come out of. There was a little cafe over the road. I remember this. This is odd how you remember these things. This is now 13 years ago as we record this. I went into the cafe over the road. I had a cup of tea and what I call an Empire biscuit, which is essentially a big jammy dodger.
Yes.
It's 2 bits of shortbread with a heart or shape in the middle and elastic jam in the middle, you know. And then I went into my very first show, and it was a musical at what was called Venue 45, and still is called Venue 45, which is the one almost directly opposite there. It's in a kind of sort of church basement. And I can't remember what the show was called, but it was a musicalised version of a fictional self-help book. So it's all how to something or other. And I do like How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. And it was a student production, and it was self-written and...
ticking all the boxes.
Yeah, it was great fun. I mean, I remember just going in. I do remember the back of my chair was very bendy. It was a fairly damaged chair, and I couldn't quite sit up straight because if I put my weight on it properly, it would bend. So I was sort of sitting upright, like in church, as it happens, I suppose. And then I came out, and then I met my friend, and then we went to George Square. Now, when you were in Edinburgh 5 years ago, no, that would have been after George Square for 2 or 3 brief glorious years, 2007, 8, 9, something like that, was the centre of musicals. It defined itself as being where music. There were plenty of musicals elsewhere, but almost everything they were doing, and it's where Jet Set Go by Brunger and Cleary started, and lots of other shows, including Only the Brave, which I didn't much like on my original viewing in the university campus building, which was their main lecture room. But has since been developed and is now available online. If people want to watch it as part of the virtual Edinburgh Fringe here on Musical Talk, they can. But I mean, that's taken many years to develop and manifest itself. But David Herzog, who of this parish, did his show about George M. Cohan there because he was studying at LIPA, the Liverpool University of Performing Arts. That's where I met him, dressed as George M. Cohan. I remember it very clearly. He had a cane and a pair of what I would call comedy trousers. But yeah, so for 2 or 3 years, George Square became my absolute focus. And then for whatever reason, George Square became much more cabaret-ish, and they put all the tents in. So it became the Spiel tents, which are like the sort of the German circus tents for cabaret. And then Underbelly went in there, and the assemblies share it now. It's like the square is divided into... The actual square became the focus rather than the buildings around it, which are still used. But they now feel like a fringe of the square rather than being the main focus. So you do just see things change all the time. It was freer and scrappier in 2007. People used to put flyers up everywhere on walls, and the council had to spend a lot of money taking them all down again. I mean, it was technically vandalism.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And now, 2 or 3 years later, I noticed they then had designated places for...
Put your flyers here.
Yeah, exactly. Which means that they could just sort of take them away without damage occurring. So much better, but at the same time, much more controlled, if that makes sense.
I was going to ask, do you think that those big conglomerations like Underbelly and Assembly, are those things that you've seen become even bigger in the last decade or so? Or do they come and go? Do you think in the next 5 years we'll have a different one that will
Well, they
supersede them.
do come and go, very definitely. I mean, you probably know last year's C has diminished tremendously.
Yes.
C used to be a major player, and indeed I always the main C venue, which was the one in Chamber Street and wasn't last year a C venue, has always been my sort of lodestone building. I sort of, I know where I am from that, but if I see C in Chamber Street, I know where I am for the entire rest of the period. I know Edinburgh well enough now to walk around it without a map. I know where all the venues are, certainly the central ones. And I know how to navigate them, and I've found all the shortcuts and the levels. That's always been the hardest thing. You suddenly realise, that road there will take me down to the level beneath. So instead of walking as I used to all the way down the road and then coming all the way back up the other road, I now have a shortcut. So,
yes.
But yes, C has diminished tremendously. Some venues come and some venues go just under the ownership of those umbrella companies. So they try rooms out and then they aren't available another year, or they're being refurbished. There was. Used to see a lot more Zoo buildings. There was the Zoo Roxy, which then became the Assembly Roxy. And Zoo still does have a presence, but it's very much diminished. So I think what you see is them being squeezed out. On the other hand, Greenside, which as far as I can gather is a conglomeration of churches, seems to have really increased in the last few years.
Yes,
but
true.
If you book them, you can't perform on Sunday because obviously they're being used for
As a
what they were
church.
their original purpose, as it were. So that's quite interesting for the performers who book a Greenside venue. Although on the other hand, it's probably better for their rhythms because they know they get one day off a week because it's a long old stretch, isn't it? Did you do the full 3 weeks when you were up there the first time?
Yes, we did. I can't remember how many performances, but we started on something like the 3rd of August and we were there until the 31st of August, which was
the full whack.
Painful when it got to that last day when everyone had left and we were the last ones there, and that's when Edinburgh seems like a ghost town, even though it's how it normally is.
Yeah, comparatively empty. Yeah.
Yes, and it felt like a slog. A nice slog, a slog that I enjoyed because we had done 2 previews in Liverpool and we'd done 2 previews in Stockport before that, and a preview in Central. So it had felt like a long journey.
A tour, that is.
Yeah.
So did you notice anything about the nature of the Fringe over the 3 weeks? Because I only ever go in the first week or the second week. That's usually when I go. I very, very rarely go in the third week when it's heading towards the bank holiday. And if you like, I'm not going to say it runs to seed, but there's perhaps a sense that it's getting a bit scrappier because people are getting tired and it's coming to, and they can see the end of the run. What was your experience as a performer?
I think you've kind of summed it up. There's definitely an excitement around the first week and maybe into the second week, and that's when it feels like it's in its prime at that point because you're still far away from the end and you've been there long enough to feel established in that. So once it gets to that kind of middle of the road period, I felt very comfy, and you kind of feel like, I live in Edinburgh now, and you can roam the streets like you are from Edinburgh. But yes, then I think once it gets to the third week and you're nearing the last 3 or 4 performances, there is a sense of tiredness and exhaustion amongst the group, and the routine of having to get into spot in 3 minutes it wears thin.
Yes, the excitement's no longer there.
Yes, and when people would start showing up 45 minutes in preparation, people would show up 2 minutes before they needed to be there. The effort had diminished greatly. It's understandable. People get worn out by the end of it.
It is very tiring. I find it tiring as a punter.
And there was something really satisfying for me I remember now because this is growing up, just personal stuff, but I don't do well in cars, and the journey from Stockport to Liverpool to Edinburgh had been by car, and I was very anxious about it because I was also travelling with people who I'd just met for this show, and I remember when the day came where we all said goodbye, and I think I had done something quite sneaky and bought a ticket explicitly for a train that I would be travelling down back to London by myself. And although I was very sad to be leaving Edinburgh, and although I was sad to see Edinburgh in this kind of lower state, I was so excited getting on that train by myself, and in 4 hours I was back in London and I felt free. I felt like Pseudolus.
Very nice reference. I know exactly what you mean about also wanting to be on your own a bit, buying a train ticket on your own, because that's one of the things that's really hard in Edinburgh, to be on your own.
Yeah.
I don't just mean as a performer, across the board. I go up quite often with a friend who leaves halfway through my period there, and then the second half of the week I'm on my own. But I'm never on my own, because I bump into, either by design or by accident, all these people I know who I met last year or the year before, or my fellow reviewing friends, or someone else who might just be up there anyway. And so although I'm ostensibly on my own, I'm walking back to the accommodation I'm in, wherever it is, on my own, I never feel lonely. I never feel on my own. And of course I'm interviewing people and I'm seeing shows. You don't have a moment to yourself, I think, even if you're wandering around singly, as it were. Which I sort of love, but then you crave, or I do, that need to be alone. So yes, I come back to where I live, and I'm quite happy to be on my own for X number of days.
Yes.
Making tea out of my own kettle and
sleeping in a room just by yourself, for example.
Well, I've always slept in a room just by myself, but I do. I mean, that's an interesting thing. Yeah, the accommodation for performers in all. But I don't just mean actors. I mean musicians and that entire troupe and crew is quite often cheek by jowl in extremis, isn't it? You were talking about 5 in a room, I think.
Yes, I mean, not
the only way to make it economic.
Well, yeah, I mean, not to single people out who
no,
doing it, but it was.
Who can afford a hotel for a month?
Well, that's true. I think our team, so including techies and producers, we were a team of 9, maybe 10, and then we were sharing a 4-bedroom flat with another company of about the same size.
Gosh.
So there were 20 of us in a 4-bed. And doesn't...
You do the math.
You do the math, indeed.
Yeah.
QED. It was tough. Real tough. 1 fridge.
Gosh.
1 bathroom.
Being used as a secondary fridge.
Yes. Some tiffs. Some
of
fights,
course.
But, that's the fun of it. And one friend made the very sensible... Obviously, we all had partners coming up as well, so it was never just 20, and people make friends as well. So
yes.
We were averaging about 25 people a night, and one friend, she was perhaps the oldest in the group, she made the wise move on her penultimate night, I think it was her last night, she went and stayed in a hotel.
As a treat?
Yeah.
Well, I don't blame her.
So she could have her own bed in her own room.
Because the flip side of that is it's so tiring. If you do Edinburgh to the max, and it's possible to do that both as a performer and as a reviewer, or just a punter, a customer, you sleep, I think, regardless. Did you come across what they call Edinburgh Flu?
I did not, no.
You know what Edinburgh Flu is? You've worn yourself out as a performer, particularly because
yes.
When you're not performing, whenever your show is, you're on the mile flyering, and
you're out drinking.
Yeah, exactly. You burn the candle at all ends. And then you get ill, and Scotland can be wet and it can be cold, even in the summer. Not that that's necessarily the case. It's just living cheek by jowl with 20 to 25 people in 4-bedroom flat. If someone gets ill, everyone gets ill. I've known a number of performers who have had to miss performances. There was, I think I've said this in a previous episode of Musical Talk. Everyone's heard of Six, the musical, but there was another show about Henry VIII and his 6 wives, called Half a Dozen, I seem to think, and I went to see that as well. I saw them both. I thought it was an interesting set of bookends. They were doing it very differently. Henry actually appears in the second one. He's a tangible character, and they're sort of ghosts in his life as he lies dying, really, essentially. That's some are ghosts and some are real.
Sure.
But that's how that works. And regrettably, one of the actresses had got terrible Edinburgh flu, and was unable to perform, and they didn't have cover because not everyone has that privilege.
Luxury.
So they had to choose which of the 6 wives was not going to appear, and it was Catherine Howard who was identified as being the weakest link from Henry's wives, and the actress playing Catherine Howard went on to then cover for I think it was Anne Boleyn, I can't remember on the night I saw. So she was actually playing a different role. And that's how Edinburgh rolls, though, isn't it? I mean, in a way, magnificent that they rose to that occasion. That they told us at the beginning there won't be any Catherine Howard. And in fairness, Catherine Howard doesn't add much to the story of Henry. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, but you can see why she was picked.
Sure.
And I've known other people who've been up there and performed and said, last night I had to sang all my songs because I simply couldn't sing them because I had this wretched cold. Sure. I mean, that's what Edinburgh Flu is. It's just terrible cold. Because people don't eat. That's the other thing. What do you do for... eating is an interesting thing during the Fringe, isn't it? I mean, I eat much worse during the Fringe than I would at any other time of the year. It's the only time of the year when I live more or less exclusively on... I have a small selection of repertoire foods which you can pick up. So I will have hot dogs, which I never eat at any other time of the year, fish and chips from a stall. I will have sandwiches from a well-known chain of submarine-shaped sandwiches. They also do salads. That's what I discovered a few years ago. They will sell you their toppings as a salad in its own right.
Excellent.
Very useful thing to know. And that's probably stopped me getting scurvy. So I often buy 2 or 3 sandwiches during the day to tide me over, because you don't eat at lunchtime because you might be seeing a show and you might be running to the next show.
Yes.
In my bag I'll have a cheese sandwich and a tuna sandwich essentially, and I'll eat them when I've got 10 minutes. You grab water where you can. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. I mean, that's pretty. It's mostly sandwiches, fish and chips,
or if you can, you eat out, I suppose.
Yes, but because I really pack the shows in, I never really get a chance to go. I have a ritual where I have one night in a nice restaurant during my sort of stay up there.
Sure,
but only once.
I guess it depends what you come to the Fringe to do, and I know people who are quite happy to, if they're a punter, take it really leisurely and 1 or 2 shows a day. But when I went up about 4 years ago, I went with a friend.
As a punter?
As a punter. My friend Cash and I, we were there for 3 days, which is not a lot of time.
No.
But we managed to pack in 15, 16 shows. And we were running.
Yeah.
I think we had to leave one show early just so we could make one of
Is that because you knew you were going to have to do that, or is it because it was running late? Because shows do something. That's the most disheartening thing when they say the show show that you've meticulously worked out your schedule, and then something else has happened and they're running 10 minutes late.
I can't actually remember, but I think it was something like we knew it was going to overrun anyway, so we had to sneak out. Yeah, it just depends the way you want to do the Fringe, and the way I like to do it, as I think you like to do it too, is to pack in as much as you can. There is some joy in running from one show to another.
It's that sense of urgency. It's amazing, isn't it? And making it.
Of course.
Although I'm sure you've had this experience, because I've certainly had it. I've made it, but by the skin of my teeth, where the queue is going in and you're the last in the queue.
Yes.
And you sort of pat yourself, where are my tickets? But you never had trouble with food, but you appreciate it's a bit on the hoof.
Yeah, and I think when I've been there, not as a punter but as a performer, initially, I mean, there's flat of 20. Initially we all thought, we'll all cook together, it'll all be great.
Family.
And that lasts about a day when you realise that, you can't fit any of the food you've bought in the fridge. And so you do start to do kind of meal deals.
Yeah.
I think what I did was I decided that I was going to wake up before other people and try and eat that way. You make do.
I always, the secret I think in Edinburgh is to make sure that you've bought some bananas or some apples for your bag, basically. So you've got some vegetables or fruit, and it's good convenience food. You can eat an apple at any old time.
Sure.
Goes a long way, I find. So we've spoken about food, and we've spoken to a degree about sleep. There's something we really got to talk about. It's not very edifying, but it's a really important thing. Lavatories. I'm going to ask you. I'll tell you my lavatory secrets if you tell me yours.
All right. You go first.
Oh, right then, fine. Well, obviously, there's 1 million people or whatever running around a relatively confined space, going in and out of shows. So the other thing is you get people in waves.
Yes.
There's lots of people milling around, but as a show finishes, suddenly an area that might have been a little bit emptier has suddenly got 200 people in it because the tent's emptied or whatever. And obviously, human functions mean that you need a lavatory, and you can't ignore it. We all need it, and there's no point shilly-shallying around the subject.
No.
The way I've always dealt with it, it's a terrible thing to say, but I have developed over the years a repertory of favourite loo places. And I suspect a lot of people do something similar. Obviously, if you ask in a restaurant, then you make sure that you go there because it will be cleaner and nicer. And there are some absolutely terrible lavatories all over the place. So you quickly learn the ones to avoid. I remember I can tell.
I'm sure we can do a compare and contrast.
I'm sure we can. There's one venue which I'm not going to name, but and they have since refurbished their lavatories, but they had it was an enormous venue, and it seemed to have one cubicle for the gents, and it was a cubicle that really, to me, didn't look like it had been changed since about 1910. It was a proper old-fashioned loo, but not glorious and glamorous, just manky, 100 years of ill use. And it was one of the nastiest lavatories that I've ever been to. And I know on the occasions I have to go to that venue that I'm not, you steer clear. I think I won't be using that loo. What I find the best venues are funnily enough, the larger venues which have institutionalised, so quite often the university venues. So, for example, the old C venue in Chambers Street, which is the Patterhouse now, it's changed brand, as it were. certainly under the umbrella accommodation arrangements. But that has chaps and lasses down in the basement, and it's a sizable one, so you're almost guaranteed always to find a place there. I find the Pleasance Dome, which refurbished about 5 years ago, as far as busy lows go, is very palatable. Very rarely find unable to go there.
Indeed.
And the Gilded Balloon Teviot, I find quite. They're not very salubrious in the sense they stink to high heaven, but they are capacious, and that's sometimes really useful.
I think whereas your go-tos might be the university ones, mine are the hotel ones. So the Radisson Blu just off the Mile. Any of the space venues which tend to be connected with hotels.
Yeah, they're more of a hotel chain, aren't they?
And the good thing about a hotel and that's also a venue is that you can walk in and either look like a performer, a punter, or a guest.
They can't really turn you away, can they? No, quite.
And as long as you walk in with some conviction, if you know where the loos are, you're laughing.
The ones which are hardest, funny enough, are sometimes the ones in churches, bless them, because the church lavatory arrangements are normally only maybe 1 or 2 cubicles for the entire congregation, because it's not really used for very much else but church functions, and you're unlikely to have swarms of people. Sorry?
Nothing sacrosanct in that.
No, there really isn't. And I love Paradise in St Augustine's. It's a lovely, lovely venue, but I avoid the lavatory because it's literally 1 cubicle for everybody.
You reminded me that the first time I went up 5 years ago, because I was there for so long, I changed my gym membership so that I could frequent the same gym brand, but in Edinburgh. And that's what I did to get out of the house really early when it was getting too noisy and too annoying. And I could have a lovely shower there as well, and I could use the loo, and I wouldn't have anyone knocking on the door saying, "You've been in there for 3 minutes, come on."
Well, I don't think I cope very well with that option. I don't like being timed. It seems very awkward. Well, it's a terrible subject, but I'm glad we tackled it, because it really is an important thing when you're there. You do find, when nature calls, it needs to be answered, regrettably.
Or if you're looking for one other place, the Pret-a-Manger, which is just off it's on Northbridge, I think, or Southbridge. That's also got a great loo.
I think it comes down to individual thresholds of embarrassment, though. I mean, speaking both as sort of a very British culturally, there is a strong sense of embarrassment, particularly about loos. I would find it very difficult to go into a restaurant or a takeaway venue that I wasn't using as an actual punter. If I was buying something, I'd have no trouble doing so. So if I go for a fry-up breakfast, I'll merrily use the lavatory. But if I'm just popping in for the lavatory, I find that quite embarrassing, and I don't think I'd do it.
You buy yourself a kind of conciliatory fry-up
back
afterwards.
or something, yeah. Well, no. Now, something I've never done, but you have, flyering.
Yes.
Leafleting upon the Royal Mile or anywhere else. Now, that was presumably... Did you do it for the Frank Sinatra show? You certainly did it for World in Progress, which was your show up a couple of years ago.
I did it for both. And I've also done it as a flyerer.
A hired hand.
Yeah.
Under what circumstances did that come about?
That was when I went up 2 years ago. I was just looking for something else to fill the time as well. And if you play your cards right, whichever venue you fly at, they give you a free pass.
Oh, that's nice.
So I did it for Pleasance.
Well, that's not at all bad. Yeah, plenty going on there. Flyering is an odd thing for a punter. The Royal Mile is packed with performers from about 11 o'clock in the morning, busily until about 6, and then much more sporadically after 6 with more street performers rather than flyers, shall we say, in the evening. So if you walk around at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock when it's dark, you can hear people playing guitars and violins and juggling, but you're many, many fewer flyering. But it's almost compulsory that you walk down the Royal Mile at least once during the Fringe, and often a lot more. Often, if I've got 40 minutes to kill between shows, I will walk through the mile just to see what's going on. And there's always something going on. But of course you weave yourself through a mass of humanity.
Yes.
And there seem to be several ways of doing it. There's the constitutional, by which I mean a slow walk tourist, who is just sort of wandering around open-eyed, not quite knowing what's going on, who quite often get overflyered because they're too polite or they're not moving very fast. Then there's the I'm not going to be flyered, I'm just walking through, the head down, forward, human missile option.
On many nerves, Thos.
Yeah, you're recognising these types, yes. I guess. I generally take flyers willingly, actually, from shows I want to see or look interesting, even if I know I'm not going to see them. I will stop and talk to people, because I think that's the joy of the mile, actually, that you can stop and talk to someone. You may never see the show, but to discuss a show with somebody is a privilege, as Musical Talk has often shown. But you can just do it in the street. So I do take flyers, but I don't take flyers from everybody, because there is it's flies round jam thing going on. But, you know, if you are seen by other flyerers to be talking to a flyer giver, then they start swarming round you. So the moment you finish your chat and you're just putting your flyer in your pocket,
yes,
suddenly you're pounced on by 20. So what I've discovered myself, just as a punter, and people may not welcome this news, but as a punter, I take flyers where I want to take flyers, but then I put them in pockets so they cannot be seen that I'm holding flyers. Because it seems to be that if you are obviously holding a flyer, then you are... It's catnip for other flyerers.
Sure.
But that's from the point of view as a punter. Tell me from the point of view of a flyerer, both as a, if you like, an objective flyerer, someone who's just trying to get rid of flyers for someone else, and a subjective flyerer, i.e. it's your bloody show.
Take my flyers.
Yes, it's my show.
Well, I recognise all of those people and more as well. There are also those kinds of people who look starry-eyed, as if, what on earth is this road that I'm walking down? I'm going to smile at you as you present your flyer to me, but I'm not going to take it. I think those are the worst ones, the ones who really don't understand why you're handing them something. But anyway, yes, I think from my experience and from learning the tricks of the trade, you've got to get a very good spiel under your belt. You've got to be very good at saying what your show is about very quickly in a kind of very snappy way.
Pithy!
Yeah, and unsurprisingly, it's a lot easier when you're being paid to give away flyers for a show that you have nothing to do with. They just want you to give these flyers. And if you've got the help of seniors saying, you know, this show starts at this time, can you try and get rid of these many flyers? It's more than likely you're going to be able to do that. But as I've done it more and more, I've become more confident in the first year I flyered, if you told me that, you know, you should go up to people, interrupt their conversations, interrupt their meals, and ask if they want to go and see this show, I would have thought that was, you know,
a bit
terribly
much.
Rude.
Yes.
But when someone tells you that, no, they want this flyer, they want to go and see this show. Actually, most people who are in Edinburgh do want to go and see a show. They might not have anything booked, and you might be doing them a favour. You know, come and see this B-level comedian, which starts in 15 minutes' time. Sure, I will. Yeah, it's a burden that everyone has to do and everyone has to go through, I think. And
only the shows that sell out before they've arrived, of which there are almost none. Fascinating Aida don't have to flyer because they will sell out before they arrive.
That's true, yes. But I think if you've got a good team of you doing it, it's not too painful.
A team is useful, actually, isn't it?
And if you can rotate as well. I mean, when I did it with my show, we had a rota, so not everyone was doing it every day. Because it's soul destroying.
It is,
to put it mildly.
And also, I think part of the fun of going up to Edinburgh with the show is the idea that you, in the spare time when you're not running the show, you might want to see other shows. And of course, it turns out it's much harder than you think if you're advertising your own show.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of actors say that. You know, have you seen much? Oh, that's the other conversation that goes on, of course.
What have you seen?
Everybody. It doesn't matter. Yeah, quite often with flyers, actually, the flyers will say to me, "What have you seen?" So I have these odd conversations. I give people what I think, and they then tell me what they think. And you stand in queues with people who are just waiting to go into a show, and then there's two conversations in a queue, isn't there, as you're waiting for a show?
Sure.
Is this the queue for X? Because often the venue has more than one show, and so everyone in the line says, "Well, I think this is the queue for."
Why?
The kindergarten version of Sweeney Todd or whatever's being performed, and then you've got having broken that ice. You don't necessarily exchange telephone numbers or car keys, but you are. It usually follows. Have you been here long? What have you said? What would you recommend? Yeah. I get that a lot.
And I guess you have the exit flyers as well, who you've just seen this show, you might like this now.
It's a totally different show.
Yeah.
Yeah, flyering is such an interesting thing and so tiring. And there are choices for the performers as well. I remember when I was talking to Rob Winlow, when he was doing Armada, the musical up there, they used to go up the mile in costume, but they could only afford to go up, so they had a very, very magnificent Elizabeth I in full Gloriana regalia. She was a commanding presence, and of course, what a brilliant thing to have, sweeping up and down the Royal Mile. Yes. There's Elizabeth I, everybody. It was just fantastic. But they said to me that they could only do it when they were absolutely certain the weather wasn't going to be bad, because if it got wet, it would ruin it for the performance, because they didn't come up with 2 Elizabeth I costumes. No. You see that kind of thing a lot. The weather really has an effect on the Mile. Also, the only time you ever see the Mile empty is when there's a sudden Scottish shower. I've been on that one. I was interviewing someone actually in the street, and suddenly the skies opened quite unexpectedly, and we ended up under a cloister near, I think, a firm of solicitors, because it's a terrible thing, it's so rude, but I was interviewing this chap just conversationally, but a fella came up to the window and closed it from inside. It was clearly an office, and of course you forget there's real city stuff going on.
Yes,
but it's all part of the rich tapestry of experience, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
What were your principal experiences for running your show? Because there you're producing. I don't mean the ins and outs of running the show, because we have discussed some of that on Musical Talk already. I mean, did that make Edinburgh a happier experience, a less happy experience? Is it just more anxiety attached, I assume?
It did make it less pleasant. I think I was constantly... Obviously, there are things in my head that I think if I were to do this experience again, my own show, this is how I would do it differently. So I think I was very conscious of the fact that this was the first time I was taking up my own show to Edinburgh. And I wanted to make sure that I was doing enough. So any kind of social time or time where I could be seeing shows was spent kind of fretting about the show and trying to get people to come and see it, and doing more flyering, because obviously it's my show, so I want to make sure that I'm doing the heavy lifting, as it were. So I didn't see as many shows as I wanted to that year, despite the fact that I was there for 2 weeks, and I think I saw 6 shows.
Yeah, many fewer than you might expect.
Well, yeah, despite the fact that 2 years previously I was there for 3 days and I saw nearly triple that. Yeah. So that's the thing I find. That's the balance I find really hard. Is if I'm there as a punter, or if I'm there with a show that I'm kind of not hugely responsible for, I can kind of have a good time. But understandably, if you're there with your own show, there are more things to think about.
Extra burdens, really, isn't it? That's the problem. So it's more enjoyable in retrospect, almost, than being there, I suspect.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the show that you did, World in Progress, then, as we've hit the subject. We were talking about sometimes shows run late because previous shows have gone wrong or overrun or something like that. And of course that's really difficult, because the venue is in an awkward situation because it wants to get back on track, because it's also very easy to let these things get worse and worse in a way. But if one show's late, then it puts everybody's rhythm out, and the next show is also a few minutes later on top of that. There's at least one of the big names used to fine people if they were, I think, if you're more than 5 or 10 minutes beyond your scheduled slot, which caused a lot of trouble for a lot of people. I'm not asking you to dish any dirt or confidentiality or things like that, but the practical aspects of running into a room after someone else has finished it and it's still hot, and the last person is still leaving, yes, clutching a dress under their pocket and under their arm and holding a tuba or whatever it is. What's that like practically?
Well, actually, for World in Progress, we were the last show, the last slot of the night, so there was never any pressure to finish on time, and I think the show was slightly slimmer than we were intending it to be.
It was shorter than its slot in a way, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I think we gave ourselves more time than we needed, and the only things that were ever really of a concern were making sure that the tech was working. We had an unfortunate, this is kind of an oversight on my part, but we wanted there to be projections which we weren't able to manufacture in the same way, so we were using laptops and iPads and phones, which was, I guess, more interesting in a way, but we had to make sure that those things were always going to work, that they were always all charged. We always had to make sure the piano was plugged in, because there were instances where that didn't happen, and the tech as well. I'm trying to think, there was one performance where for some reason the tech desk wasn't working, and so I think that set us into a bit of a
frenzy.
Yes, every time just making sure, please, we want this to work. But no, things were comparatively calm. I think the only other causes for concern, I think a couple of nights some people went to see shows, people in our cast went to see shows before our shows, and there was one night where the show overran, and obviously they were
late coming back in, as it were.
Not late coming to be in our show, but it was getting
tight.
It was getting close to time. That wasn't so fun. But actually, no. I can always compare it to my first time with the Frank Sinatra show. The biggest cock up was one night the piano pedal wasn't working.
Oh, right.
And actually, I don't think it had been plugged in properly because there was a kind of battery light shining on and off. And I remember 19-year-old me being so concerned as to what was going to happen if this
stopped
keyboard died on me. I've always been really annoyed with keyboards anyway, because the good thing about a real piano is you don't have to worry about any of those things happening. But it was on this night that was flashing, and the first song is Don't Explain, Nina Simone, which starts off with these held legato chords, and it's meant to sound very lush. But instead, when you don't have a pedal that works, it kind of turns into a Hitchcock thriller kind of. It's meant to start boom, 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 but instead you get
sharp.
And as soon as that happened, I thought, oh my god, I've got to now try and play legato for 45 minutes with a pedal that doesn't work. And fortunately, everyone in the cast knew that this was happening, because I kind of got conciliatory pats on the shoulders every time they came on and off. I managed to make it work. It wasn't fun at all. And as soon as the show finished and we got all our stuff off backstage, I was given a big hug, which is, nice. That was not fun. But I look back on it fondly.
But it's professional, isn't it? In the sense that you had to overcome a circumstance in performance, and there's no opportunity but to soldier on through.
Quite.
You reminded me, though, as you were telling that anecdote, I remember seeing quite early on an American high school version of The Mikado. I loved Gilbert and Sullivan, as is well known, and I went to see this version of The Mikado, and it was a highly enjoyable version of The Mikado, but it was essentially in the equivalent of a church hall, and it wasn't an orchestra, it was one pianist, bless her, and she was doing a cracking job, because it's a long show with just one person on the piano, and it was the full version, they hadn't cut it down, it was it was basically 2 hours. But this was a proper old manky upright. It had probably not been tuned in about 15 years, and some of the notes didn't work, so they were silent. And they weren't on the ends, they were in the middle. Oh no. So, where most of the playing is. So this was a very, very strange version of the Mikado. It was sort of atonal. And it was so strange, it wasn't just there's one note missing. There were 2 or 3 notes missing on this slightly out of tune piano as it happens already. Yeah. So it was already a bit off. And it was like listening to the Mikado as written by Benjamin Britten. It was a highly enjoyable experience, which I never wish to do again. But that's also one of the joys of Edinburgh. The enigma of Edinburgh for me is, where do the chairs come from? Because suddenly Edinburgh has 1 million chairs for all the punters. I assume they just must be shipped in from all the other parts of the kingdom, as it were.
I guess so. I think, all the space venues are quite hotel-y. They all have corporate rooms anyway.
That's true, but when you bear in mind every church hall and every room above a pub has suddenly got 30 seats in it, and then, you're right, but even a hotel is unlikely to have enough seats to cram in every one of its conference rooms at the same time. Yeah. And still runs a hotel, so there's dining areas and things like that. There must be an influx of chairs, which I assume are ritually burnt at the end of every season.
Well, no, there must be, because last year when we saw Legally Blonde in that huge kind of arena space, that had raked seating, which I imagine is hired in from somewhere. Or is that?
I think that's infrastructure. That's the Assembly on the Mound, isn't it?
No.
Oh no, it wasn't last year, was it?
No, it wasn't.
It was down at the Assembly Hall in George Road, in the Newtown.
Yes,
you're right. That's where it was last year. And yes, you're right. That's tiered seating, and because I'd seen Persuasion there a couple of years ago, a sort of a very, very full version of Jane Austen's novel, which appeared to tell the story of the Napoleonic Wars in real time. It was quite a long show. But a grand venue. But you're right, extra seats and tiers which wouldn't normally be there. Gosh, this is what I love about Edinburgh. There's so many, many different things. I mean, the moment we stop recording, we'll suddenly remember 48 different stories, which we'll discuss, I'm sure, on another occasion.
I mean, I do the thing which you probably don't do, which is frequent coffee shops.
You're right, I don't.
There are lots of good coffee shops in Edinburgh, so that tends to be what I do in my spare time as well.
Well, I have some friends who live in Edinburgh, and we usually meet up and go to pubs. And Scottish pubs are fantastic if you like whiskey, and I do. So brands you're just not going to find anywhere else. I always try new whiskies when I'm in a Scottish pub.
Very eye-opening of you.
And if you have enough eye closing. But I love a whiskey. And on that note, I think that probably covers sort of. I mean, thank you so much, Colin, for just what must be described as a sort of a general ramble through our memories of the Edinburgh experience. But it's kind of things that really we just never. I can tell you now that we've never discussed lavatories here on Musical Talk, except possibly via Urinetown.
Yes. Well, I'm glad to be the first.
Yeah, you're breaking new ground.
Yeah.
Colin, thank you so much for sharing your stories, and I look forward to talking to you again in many places, but including back at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe when it's a physical event.
Just not in a lavvy.
No, let's avoid that. Thank you for that. Musical Talk. And that was the lovely Colm Molloy. And I hope from that conversation you got a sense of what it's like to go to an actual physical Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And who knows, next year maybe you will. Maybe we all will. Here's hoping. But if this year you didn't get to go to the actual physical Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and you even didn't get to see some of the virtual shows, then worry not, because Musical Talk is here, as it is every year, to guide you through what it thinks are the best or most interesting options that you could have seen in the world of musical theatre. Over the next few weeks and months, we'll be talking about some of the shows that you could have seen in whatever format you chose. And, as I said earlier, because this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe was the smallest for many, many years, we'll be supplementing that diet, if you will, with reviews of other shows which have previously been to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe and which have been made available in their entirety online for you to see free of charge on various streaming platforms. So, just because the 2021 Edinburgh Festival Fringe is done and dusted doesn't mean it's fully over. Here on Musical Talk, that melody lingers on, to quote Irving Berlin. And why shouldn't we quote Irving Berlin? Because when it came to show business, he knew there was, well, frankly, no alternative options. There's certainly no other business like it, he observed. Well, I think that piece of philosophy, landing squarely in your ears, tells me that it's time to stop assaulting those particular parts of your body, or indeed any other part of your body. And the best way to do that is to bring this episode to an end. What's the best word for that? You know it, and I know it. And let's say it together. 3, 2, 1, goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk presented by Thos and Colm Molloy, and edited by Thos. Copyright Musical Talk 2021. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at MusicalTalkThos. Hello, Colm, how are you?
Hi, Thos. I'm not bad, thank you. How are you?
I am fine, but I think, like you, I'm pining for the might have beens.
Yes.
And the biggest might have been this year, 2020, of course, is the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, which hasn't happened for perfectly reasonable reasons. They're the best kind of reasons, the reasonable ones. In fact, so much so it's got the word in it. But we here at Musical Talk obviously miss the EdFringe very much because it's such a powerhouse of new musicals. As you know, as someone who has presented your own new musical at Edinburgh, not just in living memory, but in the last few years,